I think one of the key features is the function of press clubs in Japan, so these Kisha Club. And I'm sure everyone in the room is very familiar with Kisha Club and perhaps how they work, but you can't really talk about media in Japan without kind of diving into this area. So for those of you who might not be familiar with what these press clubs are, they've been around, as I mentioned earlier. I think the first one was in 1890. So they've been around since the early years of newspapers in Japan. But it wasn't really until after World War II that their more sort of contemporary function developed. So what they are, it's a system where all of the major government, all of the government ministries, local authorities, police, corporate and industry, etc., they all have these sort of embedded press clubs within their own organization. So each of the major television stations and each of the major newspapers has reporters that are assigned to these specific agencies. And obviously, when you think in terms of what the role of a reporter should be, and that they should have no ties to, well, should is, I guess, my own viewpoint on that. But the concept that reporters should be reporting on government behavior, government abuse and misuse of power, that becomes really difficult to do when you're embedded within those industries and ministries. So basically what happens in these cases is that the function or the purpose of doing this, the pros for it, is that you get these sort of a very fast dissemination of information. You have the press corps sort of already there 24/7. So information is sort of handed out to these press members through press conferences, press releases, etc. And there's also the idea behind that having the press there all the time also opens up those institutions to scrutiny, that they can't really get away with anything if the media is here all the time. But when the media is in your back pocket, just because they're in your pocket or just because they're there doesn't mean that they're actually going to be scrutinizing what's happening. So the negative sides of this and what's actually happening, there's a few different practices that are continually criticized in terms of the role of these Kisha Club. And one of these is this process or practice called Yochi Asagake, which is where the members of the press corps sort of early morning and then late at night are visiting with the heads of all of these, the ministries and the other organizations that they're attached to. So they're doing this to get these sort of one-on-one FaceTime with these individuals. And through that process of, day in, day out, making FaceTime with these people, they're creating interpersonal relationships. And as people in, Western media tend to criticize that, there shouldn't be that sort of overlap between politicians and media. They should be two separate entities. So you have this sort of currying of favor between, the members of the press with the people they're supposed to be covering. And the reason they're doing that is so that they have access to the stories, to the news that's coming out. So the closer you can get to these individuals, the more likely it is that you're going to be, the one given access to this information. There's another practice called Kokuban Kyote, which is blackboard agreements. And through this process, there's a lot of sort of backroom agreements made by the members of the media themselves. So within one of these Kisha Club, all of the members will decide what information they can report on and what they're going to leave out, or what stories will get covered or won't get covered, who's going to cover what in what order. All of that information is sort of decided by the members of the Kisha Club. And then the details or the decisions are written up on a blackboard, and that's why they're called the Kokuban Kyote. So the members of the press corps can enter into the room that's assigned for the Kisha Club and just check on the board what the decisions are that have already been made. So there's not a lot of freedom in terms of individual reporting under this system. It's kind of these informal decision-making process that creates sort of a sameness in media coverage across the board. Another feature of these Kisha Club that is often criticized is who can be a member. So traditionally, membership was limited only to the top newspapers and top television stations. And this was cutting out any sort of independent media, minor media stations and papers. Magazines have been excluded. Foreign media has been excluded. So it really limits access to, especially high-level information, but information across the board in Japan. So information and news stories would have to be filtered down then. So the top news stations and papers would get the information first, report on it first, and then everyone else could report after that. There were some changes made in 2009 to that structure. So it has opened up membership in Kisha Club or press clubs for some more people, but the process which was installed at that time kind of makes that opening of membership a bit questionable. And what I mean by that is, once they slightly opened up membership, they institute a process where all the questions have to be submitted on paper in advance. So if a press conference is being held, any of the minor news media, any questions that they've submitted are sort of put at the bottom of the pile. And often, oops, time runs out, we didn't get to that question. And this process of submitting questions in advance obviously favors the questions asked by the stations that are asking the most favorable questions of the administration, the softball questions. So those get to the top. Answers are prepared in advance. It's not really what we would call investigative journalism. It's, again, this is veering very close to state media. Through that process, there are a couple outcomes that are often talked about in terms, Japan is sort of the example of the most structuralized form of access journalism, meaning you really have to be a member of one of these Kisha clubs in order to get the information. There are other ways, of course, to report on things, but you need the access. So access journalism leads to something called sontaku, or a type of self-censorship. It's a bit broader than what we call self-censorship in Japan, but sontaku implies that the individual media outlets themselves tend to manage and curate the stories and the reporting that they do based on what they think will be least offensive or curry the most favor, depending on what your political affiliation of your press outlet is. So if you're a more right-leaning newspaper, you're going to be publishing stories that are more favorable to the current administration. If you're a more left-leaning news outlet, you are less likely to publish anything very critical because of the possible penalties against you. So if you are seen to be publishing something critical of the government, if we go back to that Broadcast Act, all of those stipulations about media being neutral, basically what's happening right now is that the current administrations, or not just the current one, but former administrations as well, have been looking at media reporting, and if anything is critical of current media, then it's not impartial, and therefore it's not to be allowed. So press memberships, the membership in the Kisha clubs, are pulled by a lot of the press, or they're kind of put in the corner in a timeout box for a while if they've reported something that they shouldn't have reported. So that leads to a lot of self-censorship. The ownership of the individual media outlets are sort of trying to control the reporting or control the journalism within their own company in order to continue these connections between their reporters and the Kisha clubs to maintain their membership. And there's a lot of sort of horizontal integration as well. So that's more of like the vertical form within one media organization. But horizontally between these organizations, you get a lot of kind of arm twisting and sometimes a bit of hair pulling as well between the different newspapers or television outlets in terms of what should and should not be reported. So a lot of the newspapers are sort of pitted against each other to try and make sure everyone toes the line. And there's also a lot of claims about the unethical nature of a lot of sort of parties that are held between the Kisha clubs and the government agencies that they're charged with reporting on. So the Boninkai and the Sobetsukai and all of that are held. In the U.S. they have the press dinner yearly, and that's always something that's criticized. Whether the president comes and they roast the president, and that's a one-off per year. But these parties in Japan are like all over the place and all the time. So that's another often focused on issue. So that's the basic structure of the Kisha club.